Johann Hari, you are the well-known author of the bestseller Lost Connections, Why You Are Depressed and How to Find Hope, a book packed with explosive revelations about our epidemic of despair, and I quoted the appraisal of Naomi Klein. You are an award-winning journalist, and you documented recently another book entitled Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again. Stolen Focus will be published in English the next year, and I'm very glad that Trei publishing house is translating it for the Romanian public. Anyway, thank you for being so kind to talk to us and about your last two books, Lost Connections and Stolen Focus.
I'm so excited to talk to you. Hooray.
I would like to begin with the book that Trei Publishing House already published under the title Legături, pierdute, Lost Connections. Preparing this book, you interviewed several mental health professionals who argue against what we consider as a scientifically based fact. Specifically, most of the professionals you talk to say that depression is not a chemical imbalance in the brain, and so antidepressants are only placebos. What were the reactions you got from the psychiatric establishment on that point of view?
So just to step back, I think it might be helpful to understand my answer to this, to explain why I wrote the book, which is that there were these two really big mysteries that were hanging over me. The first mystery is I'm 42 years old, and every year that I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in Britain, in the United States, and in fact, across the Western world. And I wanted to understand why. Why is this happening to us? Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And I wanted to understand this because of a very personal reason. When I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was leaking out of me and I couldn't control it. I didn't understand it. I was quite ashamed of it. And my doctor told me the story that you just said. I know you're not putting your own view, which is, oh, we know what causes depression. Some people just have a chemical imbalance in their brain. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you some drugs. So I was given a chemical antidepressant, and it did give me some relief for a while, but the effect wore off. I was taking higher and higher doses. And for 13 years, I took the maximum dose you're allowed to take, and I remained really quite depressed. So I wanted to understand what's going on here, right? If this is just a problem in our brains, why is it rising so much? This is a question, by the way, a lot of us have been asking in the last 18 months during the pandemic, when there has been an explosion in depression and anxiety. So I traveled all over the world. I interviewed the leading experts in the world about what causes depression and anxiety. And I discovered from them that there is scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are in our biology. It's not a chemical imbalance, but there are real biological factors. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not in our biology. They're factors in the way we live. And once you understand them, it opens up a whole different set of solutions to this. So it's not really about arguing against chemical antidepressants. They give some relief to some people, which is valuable. They gave me some relief for a while. But we've got to understand this problem in a much deeper and more complex way. We've got to understand the causes. And once we understand the causes, we can then begin to understand the solutions. And there was a moment when, and I found this very difficult to think about, right? Because I was very committed to this idea that it was just a chemical imbalance in my brain. And there was a moment when that helped me to really absorb a lot of the science I had been learning. I went to interview a South African psychiatrist named Dr. Derek Summerfield. And he happened to be in Cambodia in Southeast Asia in 2001, when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. And the doctors there, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs. So they said to him, what are they? What is an antidepressant? And he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need antidepressants. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of herbal remedy, like St. John's wort, something like that. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the Americans, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb. And after a while, he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. And I'm guessing it was quite traumatic to go back and work in the field where he got blown up. The man started to cry a lot. After a while, he was so distressed he refused to get out of bed. He developed what we would call classic depression. This is when the Cambodians said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, what do you mean? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to this man. They realized that his pain made sense. In fact, you only had to listen to him for 5 minutes to see why he was so distressed. One of the doctors figured, if we bought this man a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was distressing him so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. It did not come back. Mm-hmm. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have the last 30 years, that sounds like a joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from this individual unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical experts in the world at the World Health Organization have been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and practical support to get those needs met. And the second part of your question, which I'll answer much more quickly, was about the reaction. And it's been really fascinating. It was nominated for an award by the British Medical Association. Some of the leading psychiatrists in Britain and Australia and other places, people like Dr. Max Pemberton, hugely championed the book. As you would expect, because I'm saying that some aspects of psychiatry have talked about this problem in too narrow and a simplistic a way. There are, of course, some psychiatrists who are critical of the book for that reason, because I am taking on some of what they say. But in terms of the chemical imbalance theory, it's important to say one of the leading experts on this, Dr. David Healy in Wales, said, we can't even say that the chemical imbalance theory has been discredited because it was never credited. There was never a time when half of the scientists in the field believed it. That was actually a story that was invented by by public relations people. It was not a scientific theory. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't biological contributions to depression and anxiety. There definitely are. Your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems. There are real changes that happen in your brain when you become depressed that can make it harder to get out. And of course, I write about them in the book. But we have to understand depression in a much deeper way. We have not all become more depressed and anxious in the last year and a half because suddenly something went wrong with our brains. We've become more depressed and anxious because something went wrong in the way we're living and in our society as a result of the pandemic. And that should teach us something about why we were depressed and anxious so much more before the pandemic as well.
Mm-hmm. On this topic of reviewing the meaning and the explanations of the depression, the title of your book, Lost Connections, indicates the way in which you see actually depression, namely as a form of grief or for all the connections we don't have or we lost. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, as I said, I learned that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety that I go through in the book. And there's something that connects a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. So everyone listening knows they have natural physical needs, obviously. You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd obviously be in real trouble. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture that we've built is good at many things. Many things are better now than in the past. But there's evidence that in Western culture, we have been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs for quite some time now. So I'll give you a concrete example because that can sound a bit strange and one I think is particularly relevant at the moment. We are the loneliest societies in human history. I interviewed the leading expert in the world about this, a man named Professor John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, who has proven 2 things. Firstly, that loneliness causes depression and anxiety. And secondly, that loneliness has exploded in the Western world. And I remember him saying to me one day, why do we exist, right? You, me, everyone you've ever met. Why are we here? One key reason is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. A lot of the time they weren't bigger than the animals they took down or faster than the animals they took down, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. And we are the first humans ever to disband our tribes. And it is making us feel terrible. And even when we become lonelier in a necessary cause, we had to separate to suppress the spread of the virus. I'm strongly in favor of that. In fact, we should have done it sooner and harder. But even when we have to do it in a necessary cause, it makes us feel terrible. Now, that should really be teaching us something about what we need to do as we emerge from that pandemic. And I suspect we'll talk a bit more about that later.
So we lost the social connections, may I say, but what kind of other connections did we lose? Yeah,
so I go through 7 of them in the book, but I'll give you one example that I think is, interestingly, I think in some ways, Romanians probably have better insight onto, can see more clearly than British people. So everyone knows that junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, but there's also good evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. For thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is all about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel terrible, right? That's not exactly what Confucius and Schopenhauer said, but that's the gist of what they said, right? But nobody had scientifically investigated this until a remarkable man I interviewed named Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois. And Professor Kasser discovered lots of really important things. Firstly, he discovered, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by money and how we look to other people. And secondly, he's discovered that the more that happens, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by a really quite significant amount. That the more you become driven by the values of advertising and Instagram and everything like them, the less happy you become and the more depressed and anxious you are likely to be. And I spent a lot of time looking at the scientific evidence on this and discussing it with him. And there's many reasons why this is. But at the heart of it, I think Professor Kasser put it to me, is that we are trained to look for happiness in all the wrong places in the culture that we've built, right? Everyone watching knows none of you are going to lie on your deathbed and think about all the shoes you bought and all the likes you got on Twitter, right? You're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. Now, of course, a lot of Romanians will remember a very different machine that also thwarted human happiness. And we certainly don't want to return to a nightmarish vision like that either. But we've built a machine that systematically poisons and diverts our values in ways that I think is causing, and I believe the scientific evidence from Professor Kasser and others like Professor Jill Twenge shows, is actually making us significantly less happy.
So you're saying that in your example, we did lose the connections with our authentic or real or inner values, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. That we've bonded. We seek connections with things that ultimately can't satisfy us, whether it's shopping, and not saying there's no value in these things, right? There's some pleasures in them, and clearly some materialism is healthy and normal, right? But if this dominates too much of our values, if we think about screen-based interaction. For the book, I went to the first ever internet-based rehab center in the world, it's in Washington State. And it's a fascinating place where they get all kinds of people, but they disproportionately get young men who are obsessed with multiplayer role-playing games like World of Warcraft or Fortnite. And although Fortnite didn't exist when I went there, I'm sure it's what they're obsessed with now. And it was fascinating because I spent a lot of time with the young men there, and some of them had also become obsessed with pornography or other things. And it was really interesting speaking to Dr. Hilary Cash, who's the psychologist who runs that clinic, because she said, you know, why? She said it teaches us something really important. We did not evolve to interact through screens, right? Screens have some value, particularly in a pandemic, of course. But we didn't evolve to look at each other through screens. We evolved to interact face to face and to read signals that way. And after speaking to her, I began to think, in a way, the relationship between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between pornography and sex. And a lot of these young men have become obsessed with pornography. If your sex life consisted of nothing but looking at pornography, you would go around kind of irritable a lot of the time, because that doesn't meet your deeper needs as a human being, right? I mean, I'm not saying pornography has no role in anyone's life, but no one feels valued and satisfied after looking at pornography the way they do after having sex, at least if it goes well. And I think a similar thing is happening to us with screens, right? Screen-based interaction that's not about sex and pornography, which is we're spending so much of our lives in a mode that doesn't actually meet our deeper needs.
Talking about screens and social media and pornography, things like that, I would like to talk a bit about Stolen Focus, a book announced to be published in January the next year. You state in Stolen Focus, you stated that the pandemic distraction and loss of attention are not caused simply by physiological alterations. We are not talking about an ADHD pandemic, for instance. But these problems have to do with the structure and habits of our society, with the way we work, the way we manage our free or professional time. If that is the case, what can we do as individuals in order to manage our attention deficits?
This is the very first interview I've done anywhere about the book, so I've been less coherent about this. I'm going to learn a better way to talk about it. But yeah, as you say, like with the previous book, I spent 3 years traveling all over the world, interviewing the leading experts about attention and focus, and people who have been trying very different ways to improve attention and focus. And I think this is a very real crisis. The average American teenager now focuses on any one task for 65 seconds, and the average office worker now focuses on any one task for 3 minutes, which is kind of extraordinary. And I think people can really see this around them. They are struggling to focus, and a life where you struggle to focus is a life where you really can't achieve your goals or the society collective goals, right? So I want to think a lot about this, and there's a huge amount going on here. And I think as you hinted at in that question really well, part of the problem, I think, is that we've been taught to think about this as purely an individual problem, as an individual failing. Oh, I'm being weak. I'm not good enough. I must be lazy. Why can't I focus? And we've tried to kind of talk.
Not able to do multitasking, for instance.
Exactly. And actually what's happened is we have created an environment. Professor Joel Nigg, who's one of the leading experts on children's attention problems, who's at Portland State University, said to me, we've created an environment that is pathogenic for attention, in which human attention will be very difficult for human attention itself to form. And so you just mentioned one of the things, what we call multitasking. So multitasking is a term that comes from computing, right? It was invented in the 1960s. Computers can multitask because they can, they've got more than one processor, right? Humans cannot multitask. There's lots of evidence about this. What happens is, all these studies, I interviewed an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who's done some of the best work on this, that shows actually when you think you're multitasking, when you think you're doing two things at once, what happens is you're just doing both of them much less well. So let's say in the middle of me talking to you, hidden behind my laptop, I have my mobile phone, right? If I just sneak, I'm not going to do it because it'll distract me, but I could just pick up my phone and I could pretend to be glancing down while I'm talking to you. I could glance down pretending to be listening to you, and I could look at, maybe I've got a text message, right? What happens when I do, and then I switch back to you. So I switch from talking to you to the text message to back to talking to you. And when this is done in labs, all the evidence shows, there's a moment where I have to refocus on you. And in that moment, My attention for both things is broken. When you get people to perform tasks where they're interrupted, it massively degrades their ability to actually do those tasks. But part of the challenge is we are now living in what Professor Earl Miller said was a perfect storm of distractions. We are almost all constantly being distracted. It degrades your memory. It degrades your ability to think clearly. It degrades your ability to do any of the tasks you're doing. So I do talk in the book about a lot of things we can do as individuals, and I can talk about them if you want. But I also think we need to do something. This needs to be a political and social, we need a political and social response as well. Because the truth is, my phone behind my laptop is designed by some of the cleverest engineers in the world, whose job is to distract you and me and everyone we know. And I interviewed a lot of these engineers. Now, every time you put down your phone, as Tristan Harris puts it, who's one of the leading former Google engineers, there is an army of people whose job is to design very sophisticated technology to get you to pick that phone up again, because they lose money if you put it down. So we've got to have both a personal response, and I go through in Stolen Focus lots of things we can do personally, but also a political response. Someone's got to stop those people doing that to us. And we can do that through government regulation. Think about something like lead paint, right? Older people watching will remember it used to be that people painted their home with lead paint, and that had a catastrophic effect on people's attention, right? It damages your IQ. Children who grow up in homes with lead paint find it much harder to focus, right? Now, we didn't ban paint, right? People still paint their homes. You've got lovely paint on your wall behind you. What we did is we banned lead in paint. In a similar way, we need to ban many of the aspects of these technologies that are designed to invade our attention. Doesn't mean we get rid of the technologies. I'm not suggesting we all go and join the Amish. That would be a nightmare in a different way. But we can, in a very targeted way, do that. But that you can't do that on your own, and I can't do that on my own. We can restrain ourselves a bit, and that has value. What you and I can do as individuals is be part of political movements that create political pressure to prevent the invasion of our attention.
Okay, finally, I would like to end our discussion with the more personal question. What is the most significant change in your lifestyle you made after learning so many wise things from the mental health professionals you interviewed in the last years?
Yeah, it's a good question. There were quite a lot. In my own case, I'd experienced quite a lot of trauma when I was a child, and being able to process and think about that and release the kind of shame was a big change. But actually the biggest, in some ways I'm slightly embarrassed to say it, because in some ways it might seem quite simple. I interviewed a woman called Dr. Brett Ford, who's a fantastic social scientist, who's at Berkeley, was at Berkeley when I interviewed her. She's in Toronto now. And she did this research, and I think Romanians again would have a better insight on this than British people. So she was with a huge team of social scientists all over in several countries. She was part of this research. So they wanted to figure out, if you, as an individual, decided you were going to spend, let's say, 2 hours a day trying to make yourself happier, would it work? And they did this research. Would you actually become happier, right? And they did this research in 4 countries. They did it in the United States, Russia, Japan, and Taiwan. And what they found at first seems really odd. In the United States, if you try to make yourself happier, it doesn't work. You don't become happier. But in the other countries, if you try to become happier, it does work and you do become happier. And they're like, well, that's weird. Yeah, exactly. It's so strange. So they looked at it more, and what they discovered is, in the United States, if you try to make yourself happier, in the main, you do something for yourself. You go shopping, you show it off on Instagram, you work harder to get a promotion, to spend something on yourself. You do something. So the American narrative about happiness is instinctively individualistic, right? In the other countries, of course, there are exceptions on both sides, but in the other countries, Russia, Taiwan, and Japan, in the main, if you tried deliberately to make yourself happier, you did something for someone else, your friends, your family, your community. So, so those countries have an instinctively collective idea of what it means to be happy. And it turns out just individualistic theories of happiness just don't work very well, right? If we were a species of individualists, we would have died out on the savannas of Africa. We wouldn't have formed groups that meant we survived. So for me, I realized how much, after I interviewed Brett Ford, I realized how much when I used to start feeling down and depressed, I would lean very heavily on this individualistic way of thinking. I would try to achieve something for myself. I would, you know, show off and actually now, and of course I still do that sometimes, that's part of everyone, but now when I feel those feelings coming, I never get depressed now, but when I get, you know, feel unhappiness coming, what I try to do is do something for someone else, right? And you know, I'm not Oprah, I can't turn up and give them a car, but often it's just something as simple as just put your phone away and listen to them. You know, in a very lonely culture, just listen, genuinely, properly listening to people is a profound gift, right? So I've tried to move from a sort of individualistic, from dealing with my own unhappiness in this individualistic way to dealing with, when I do feel unhappy, that unhappiness in a collective way. And for me, that has been an incredible change and really has just massively helped me.
Okay, so thank you, Johann Hari, for your illuminating answers, and also for your two marvelous books, Lost Connections and Stolen Focus.
I'm so grateful to you. Thank you for the great questions. And I'm hopefully going to come to Romania to give a speech next April. So I hope we can meet up, and I'm really excited to hear the responses of Romanian readers. So please, anyone who's read it, my email address is just chasingthescream, scream like at gmail.com. And I'm really grateful to you and all the stuff you guys have done for the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.